Welcome to the Fireside chat called Exploring the Use of Behavioral Science and Neurotech to Understand Human Behavior and Solve Social Challenges. Our everyday life is based around decision making, so is our policy. Every day, policymakers debate how to better solve our social challenges, how to ensure safety, security, health, and happiness of the citizens. Today, we will talk about this with Dalia Bagdziunaite, a behavioral science and consumer neuroscience expert. She currently works within public policy innovation field by coordinating the Policy Lab project in Lithuania. Our chat will center around understanding how people make decisions, how could we better understand them using the technology, and finally, what cues it can provide to policymakers and how can they apply this to solving policy challenges. So let's start with you, Dalia. How did you come about to be interested in neurotechnology?
Hi, Arūnė, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. So consumer technology and just general decision neuroscience came into my life pretty unexpected while I was studying at Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. So I had a chance to take an elective called Neuromarketing and Consumer Neuroscience, where I was really inspired by Professor Thomas Weiger-Ramsøy, who was teaching the course. And after that, I followed up the field with my PhD studies, where I had the chance to study compulsive buying with physiological and neural responses measuring tools and technologies.
Now, that sounds very exciting. I think it's still very rare to see this kind of expertise, especially in Lithuania. But let's start maybe from the beginning. And can you explain us in plain language how people make decisions? You know, there's a lot of papers in very specific academic terms that a lot of people cannot understand. But how can you explain it to everyone who listens to us today?
So I would love to have a plain answer. However, we human beings and our brain is a very complex phenomenon. But if I would be looking for my own discipline, we would follow an assumption that we human beings are not fully conscious. And so we do not take fully rational decisions. We do not follow logical thinking, and we strongly rely on emotion, habits, and different type of impulses. When I speak about conscious and unconscious processes, literature shows that we are basically driven by our unconscious processes, and only a small part of our decision making is driven by the conscious processes. So when I use these type of terms, I use it more from the cognitive perspective. So I do not refer to the unconscious state as, for example, being fainted or sleeping. I also do not talk about let's say, Freud's philosophy of hidden desires or like childhood memories or childhood experiences. I speak about the threshold of our awareness. So science shows that, for example, visual stimuli, the brain can read visual stimuli in 32 milliseconds. Yet our conscious awareness is not yet there, so we are not visually perceiving those stimuli. So those processes that happen in our brain and our body are called the unconscious processes. So when we speak about decision making, I would really love to mention a theory introduced by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. It's a pretty well-known theory, and I highly suggest everyone to read their book, Thinking Fast and Slow, because it gives a very nice simplified insight into how we humans process information and how we make decisions. So in a simplified manner, we have those so-called two systems, system 1 and system 2. So system 2 is, let's say, a pilot. So if we are a plane, our system 2 is a pilot, which is controlling different buttons, making evaluations for our consequences of our behavior, and make different types of logical reasoning. System 1 is the one which is driven more by automatic processes. So there relies our emotions, our habits, our implicit memories, and science shows that most of our behavior is actually driven by the system 1, so the automatic one. So to put it in a simple way, let's say we're trying to learn to bike. So during the first days, the system 2, the pilot one, helps us to learn like to learn new information and to learn new behaviors. Then that behaviors goes into the system 1, which then is being triggered automatically. So these type of processes in decision making help us to actually have more space for learning new things and for doing other things that we shouldn't learn them again over and over again.
Yeah, I'd like to contribute to the book recommendation, because after reading that one, I've definitely got very interested in all the behavioral science, behavioral economics aspect as well. And I think that's probably one of the best kind of readings for anyone kind of looking into more popular science kind of perspective into this field. But we talked how people make decisions and maybe how more like the brain works, but where does technology come in? Because as you mentioned, you got interested into like neurotechnologies. Why do we need technology to understand human behavior if you already explained all the theory? where does technology fit in?
Yes, so if we take an assumption that we are not rational human beings and we do not take purely logical decisions, then naturally if we want to understand the behavior, it's not enough to ask people about their behavior, because they might say what they think, but that might not represent the actual drivers of their behavior. So from the neuroscience perspective, let's say emotions play a very important role in our decision making. And emotions we define not as the feelings. So emotion is something that is going on in our body and our brain in response to different things that are going on around us. And feeling is something that we put the label on. So if, for example, I meet a person I like, I might have like a brain response, as well like a body response that later on I interpret as a fear or attraction. So from my point of view, if we want to have a more complete picture of the decision making and of the actual drivers of the behavior, we need to look at the physiological and neural responses and not only investigate attitudes or opinions of the people. So here, technology can help us to actually have more implicit measures of certain drivers of our decisions and our behavior.
What kind of specific kind of technologies or methods both are used widely, and also maybe which ones you tried using during your research?
So I would divide those methods into 2 types. One would be measuring body response, and another type would be measuring neural response. So the first branch of methods would be maybe called more biometric tools or biosensor-based tools, and the other type of methods would be called more like neurotechnologies. So all of them come from the medical science and has been used and is still used for diagnostic purposes, for different, trying to investigate different diseases, but had been recently adopted in more applied fields, like for instance, marketing. Body response technologies or like measures can help us understand, for example, responses coming through the eyes or through the sweat or through different emotional changes in our facial expressions. So for example, the eye tracker is the technology, basically the glasses with the camera that can help us to investigate where the person is looking at, how people process different information, if they notice something in their environment, how fast did they look at it, what they haven't noticed, and so on. Let's say a facial coding, which is usually done through the camera by recognizing different muscles in our face. So basically we have 2 types of muscles that reflect our emotions. It's the muscles around our mouth and our eyes, can help us to identify different emotional states. So we can investigate whether the person has a positive response or negative response. And we can also even investigate different states of the emotion while the person, for example, is watching a video or is in a certain environment or even listening to the lecture. And then, for instance, skin conductance, biosensor, which helps us to measure skin conductance response, so sweat response, can help us identify the stress reaction or excitement. And that can be helpful if we want to, for example, study what type of environment makes, let's say, people work more productively, which type of, design could help cancer patients to get better treatment, and so on. When we speak about neurotechnologies, we usually talk about functional magnetic resonance, which is basically a very prominent technique in the medical field, and also electroencephalography. So functional magnetic resonance is measuring changes in the oxygenated blood flow in different brain areas. And by basically recording those changes, we can see how the person is reacting to different type of information as well, while they are in the scanner. Electroencephalography is more applied to in a realistic settings, because we can put the helmet with the electrodes, and then by measuring electrical activity, we can understand different metrics such as motivation, emotion, and a propensity for action. And in that sense, we can have a better picture of the decision in a certain situation or while being exposed with different information.
So basically, if we do not trust the humans themselves to kind of recognize why they're behaving in a certain way, or why they're making a certain decisions, that kind of technology can help us, as I mentioned, understand then those drivers behind it, right? Not just the surface and the decision itself, but why it came about, so that we can address not the decision, but the root causes of the decision. Yeah.
So often we also do not differentiate that much between those two types, because I think they complement each other very well, because it gives more holistic picture of the human behavior, because the attitudes is also important. But as we know that sometimes people might say one thing and then do another thing. Let's say, I don't know, people often promise they will quit smoking that they never do at the end of the day, because it's a bit stronger than just a conscious thought. It's a behavioral pattern that needs to be changed. So those type of technologies or methods help to get a better picture of the entire mechanism of a decision, and not only the reasons or motivations of those decisions.
You, of course, mentioned from your research and that you became interested in from more of a like consumer and like marketing perspective. So where, I guess, could you expand on, how is it used actually in this field, and maybe like other fields that's the most prominent, because it's still quite new in most of the fields, right? It hasn't been around for very, very, very long, this kind of research.
Yes, so in the marketing field, the first experiments have been done in 1990s, but actually the field of neuromarketing and consumer neuroscience evolved only in 2002. And right now, I would say in this field, the knowledge stemming from psychology and neuroscience, and also tools coming from there, like neurotechnologies, are used to better understand consumer behavior. And it could be used for different purposes, to design better communication or like a better marketing solutions, or to also inform consumers, so for consumer protection or consumer policy purposes. Later on, this application, we call it applied neuroscience. So application basically have been adopted in different fields, such as design, nowadays architecture, ergonomics, also public policy. There are several cases of this being used in politics, and also education or other social or other cases for social good. So I really like one type of use of these technologies, and it's called consumer neurotechnologies. field where basically it's used for self-development and improvement. So for example, one of my colleagues, Morten Friis, together with Baldur Onorheim, created so-called Plato Science device. So it's a helmet that you put on your head, and that can stimulate certain brain parts with the electrodes, and that can facilitate better cognitive abilities and more creative thinking during performance of the creative tasks. So there are different type of examples. There is also like another neurotech, consumer neurotech device gadget called Muse, which can help you to meditate and relax and so on. Another, I think, also interesting way of using these neurotech, where with a more like a neurofeedback principles, is to treat different anxieties or also even PTSD in the soldiers, which I think it's a very nice way of using it for social good.
I think this is kind of a good segue into talking more about like using this technology and methods to actually solving more social challenges, because as you mentioned, a lot of it has developed from the marketing or more like profit-seeking perspective, but of course, as many of the tools, it can be used in different ways. So you mentioned a few examples of how it has been used to kind of understand and solve some like social issues. What do you see as kind of the main differences between using it in the private and the public sector? Because of course, I mean, the implications are much bigger if you design the whole policy based on this, rather than if you just release one ad from one company, right, based on these kind of assumptions.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think there are several like differences in those two fields. So one thing is the environment in which we run the study. So if we want to understand certain behavior, especially the brain response or body response, so we human beings, we always function, so it's never stopping. So in that sense, we really need to understand what we are measuring and in which type of environment. So when we think about the private sector, the scope of the research is much smaller. And so it's much easier to actually understand certain things, because it's much easier to design experiments in a way that you can control for certain aspects and really understand that this response was due to this ad, or I don't know, like a product design or something like that. When we talk about more realistic setting, and especially our like society in which we have a lot of target groups, like different type of people, different types of situation, it's much more difficult to actually design the experiment and generalize to apply it in a wider scope. So as an example, I would say, I think it would be a very interesting study if instead of, I don't know, when we are setting up biplanes, instead of just drawing a line, put a helmet with the camera and also eye tracking glasses and run the study on, let's say, 40 bikers and see how they would be going around. Would they notice certain signs on the road and so on? And then, according to that, draw the lane. So it would be more intuitive for the ones that are driving as well. But in this sense, we could do that, in a certain neighborhood in Vilnius, but maybe doing it in the entire Lithuania would be much more difficult, because we would have to do it in each case. So I think it's more applicable in this broader sense in the smaller scopes. So if the problem is more aimed for a smaller scope, then it's more applicable. But sometimes it's more difficult to run those type of studies and generalize the findings when we talk about the complex and big problems.
I think from what I hear from you as well is that some of the urgent social challenges that are emerging, like sometimes requires a bit more urgent response, right? And this has to be very much like thought through and designed, and it cannot be kind of organized in a rushed manner, because otherwise that can have a very negative implications, right? And would kind of provide also then the policymakers kind of that just a tool saying that, you know, we use this as methods without actually designing it properly. So that's, I guess, one of the threats of trying to use all the new methods without actually properly designing them.
I also think it's very important, the goal, you know, really understanding what you're measuring, because it's more like a deductive approach rather than explorative approach. So of course, we can use it for exploration to better understand, I don't know, how people, for example, are walking around like tourists, how they are exploring Vilnius. I think it would be also an interesting study that we could actually try to figure out the attraction points by putting the eye trackers, or I don't know, like some interesting tools to measure their emotional response in different points, and then designing it accordingly. But yes, I think it's more of a deductive approach. So usually you already thought through what could be the potential things that you're looking for, and then you're running a study. And another thing that I also would like to mention is that when we speak about these new tools and innovation, especially related to the human body, human brain, we have all these questions regarding ethics, legal questions, and also society questions linked to the rights, you know, of the people and so on. And in here, I think also it's more difficult when we talk about societal use rather than like a public sector use rather than private use, because in the private sector, we already have certain rules and recommendations established so we can follow them. But I'm also very glad that organizations like OECD already started the debates and even are drawing recommendations for sustainable and responsible innovation in neurotechnologies. So it's not prohibiting, because technology by itself is not an evil. It's like how we are using it and what for we are using it. So I'm very glad that it's already in the public sector. We already have conversations about it and trying to draw recommendations instead of prohibiting, but actually giving a guidance of how to do it.
And where do you think in the future kind of the main areas, both in like the policy, you mentioned quite a few examples, but where would kind of the main hotspots where would be actually like useful, not just like trendy, but actually useful to use this kind of tools, in which policy areas, but not necessarily maybe policy, but just in general, you know, around what kind of challenges and problems it could be used?
Yeah, I think that actually this field maybe could be explored more in depth in exactly like for social issues, like solving social issues. And I see, for example, like a great potential for, I don't know, testing social campaigns, because it's just like video ads or something. And the impact of those campaigns is very important, because sometimes those campaigns can change the numbers in, I don't know, let's say road safety, in how many people would wear the seatbelt, or like, how many traffic accidents we would have at the end of the day. So I believe those tools could be used in this type of, for these type of cases as well. I really like the use of these measures and technologies and approaches in education. Because, for instance, facial coding and facial expression reading, even now, like during our conversation, we could be following the expressions and understanding each other much more better by actually, and then rearranging the talk so it would become more interesting in the moment, you know. So some companies are using that for the conferences, so they are experimenting with that, but it's not much used actually in the broader settings. I also like the use of these type of tools in creating more immersive museum experience. And I know in some countries, they do testing before, like in arrangement of different artworks. And in that case, actually helping more people, like fostering more people to come and visit and actually improve their cultural knowledge. Yeah. And I also actually was thinking, I would like to mention one example that was done by Vilnius municipality. And I really liked that case. So what they did a boost where basically people were entering Vilnius municipality, and through the facial expressions and also respiration and arousal measures, they were collecting so-called happiness index. So this project was done together with VGTU, and with the researchers, and I think it's still continuing. And I really like this approach of actually looking at the happiness index through the emotional states, because usually when we measure different countries' happiness index, we look at the very rational measures such as economic welfare, like stability and so on. But the actual happiness is most probably in the human being. So it's in our emotional state. So I think it gives a nice perspective and approach on top of what we actually have.
I think, and from what you were saying and expanding slightly on the ethics topic, I think you mentioned a few very distinct kind of examples. Some of them were more where you choose to participate in something, as in you choose to have more immersive that experience in the museums, and you as well. Well, maybe not as much of a choice when you see the kind of social campaigns, but still not very invasive in the sense. While others that sometimes might be seen as more like impactful, but there might be where you don't really have like when you become a participant without actually kind of consenting to being a participant, right? And this is, I guess, where the threat of these kind of powerful technologies lie, where because they can be used to understand human behavior, they can be very easily used to understand human behavior, not for happiness and solving social challenges purposes, but for more kind of malicious purposes as well, right?
Yeah, I think in here it's an interesting debate that should be maybe taken on the bigger level as well. Like, but I also think that the society should not be so much afraid of technologies, because sometimes we are afraid of what we don't know, and it's, of course, it can have its own like consequences, like the way you were saying, like in China, it's used for citizen monitoring. And I think in that sense, there is again an ethical question of like, how far can we go and how much of intrusive it is. And I think it calls for debates, and also not only debates within the entire like sector, but also in each country, most probably, because it depends also on the citizens' will of like them wanting to be tracked or not wanting to be tracked, or like yeah
I guess it depends on the cultural norms of the
yeah
country as well. And just kind of to start to finish off, how do you think we can start these debates and kind of accelerate them? How we can kind of make that conversation more lively, not just between a few policy experts, but rather kind of understood more broadly.
So I actually think that you're doing one of those steps with with like lectures and conference that is going on right now, when we even are talking about these type of things. But I think also that it's important to involve academics and people not only from Lithuania, but maybe people working with these questions uh, on the policy level. Also, uh, like ethical committees and people from different perspectives, and people from the legal field, and as well society like itself, because I think it's important to hear what they think about. But at the same time, I believe it's also important to spread just generally spread the knowledge about that. So maybe even in the media, talk about it more, not only in one direction, but look at different perspectives, because sometimes we catch one direction and we stick to it.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Dalia. Really appreciate you talking with us today and sharing your knowledge with our audience. And as you said, I think this will be great steps towards that broader kind of understanding what neurotech is and how it can be used to kind of understand the human behavior.
Thank you so much, Arūnė. Thanks.
Thank you.